Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Today will be a short show. I've only got like 10 slides just to finish off from part one. Email them on hello and welcome. Been finding some really interesting things about Martin Luther. I should share them with you. Really learning so much about this man. So, yeah, episode one, we were discussing church continuity. We were discussing the claims about the Great Apostasy or a great falling away, and the fact that we can trace historically that there was continuity and development within the church. The church grew as an organization. There was growth in terms of defining the doctrine. The church was dealing with heresies. It wasn't a very detailed, it's not meant to be an overwhelmingly detailed, complex review. It was just an introduction. And then in the next series, I will talk about the Baptist church as an illustration of the problem of claiming that there was great apostasy and the kind of lengths, the foolish lengths they went to, and describe the heresies they discussed. So welcome, Sandro. Hey, I saw your videos. No, I saw your messages. I need to watch those videos. And hello, do you always change your name? You know, how's it, Mebru? So let us dive into where we were. All right, so hopefully you've all downloaded the church continuity timeline. On the first video, I added it as a pinned comment, and I also added it to the description. So if you want to, you can download it. If I need to make any changes to the church continuity timeline, do let me know and I can update it and change the file. So then, but yeah, awesome, Ignatius. Welcome. Good to see you too. Okay, let's go to part two. It's only 9 or 10 slides tops, right, for this evening. And then part two, we'll be discussing the Baptist Trail of Blood. And that was hysterical to go through. Right, so there are methodological problems in the apostasy narratives, right? And this poor historical method undermines these claims. Very often we see people reading modern ideas into ancient history. So they'll project modern denominational distinctions onto ancient Christianity. When you do an honest reading of what's in the early church fathers, for instance, you don't find the Baptist church, you don't find independent fundamental Baptists, you don't find Calvinists, you don't even find Lutherans. So, and you certainly don't find Pentecostals. Hello, George. Yeah, you know, you're still misspelling my name. You know, I'm not gonna be able to sleep tonight by having seen that. Thank you very much. A witness to the fall of Islam. You know, people are talking about the Sharia now. I remember 5 years ago when I started talking about it, everyone thought I was a freak. I was on the fringes. Now everyone's talking about the Sharia. People are starting to learn what the Sharia is. So things are changing. Things are definitely changing. Welcome, Philip. Okay, so early Christianity was unified. One doctrine, right? There was an authoritative structure. There was a single doctrine. There wasn't a bunch of contradictory doctrines. We can't say that John was a Pentecostal, and then Paul was a Baptist, and then Philip was an independent, fundamental Baptist. And then, of course, you had a Zwinglian, you know, maybe James was a Zwinglian. No, they had a single doctrine, and when they had a problem, they would meet in council, they would discuss, they'd make a decision, and they would follow that decision. It meant that they didn't just read the Bible alone, like in Acts 15. They actually decided, no, we're not going to follow the Old Testament. We're going to reject that. We're going to create our own doctrine, and they created a new tradition. So there was one Catholic church, grounded in apostolic teaching and their authority. They were not divided into denominations like modern Protestant and Orthodox churches. And the existence of heresies was very well documented. If you've read Irenaeus, if there's one thing you should read, it's Irenaeus Against Heresies. Just read it. It is fascinating. It tells you, no, we've got this doctrine and these are heresies. And if you recognize Protestant dogmas and doctrines within what he terms heresies, yeah, don't blame me. So, but the existence of heresies also shows us the church's doctrinal unity against error. Right now, Calvinists and Arminians still can't come to any kind of conclusion or decision. They've been debating for 500 years. they're completely contradictory, but yeah, nobody wants to say the other one is wrong. Well, and say, yeah, well, one of us has to give up our position. Too much pride. Now, of course, there's also the assumption that ancient Christians thought in very modern theological categories. So early Christians would use different vocabularies shaped by their own cultural and historical contexts, but they would consistently affirm core doctrines like apostolic succession and the authority of Scripture and Church without modern theological jargon. Something actually I do want to raise. Let me bring up a point here. Let me actually bring up something that is also interesting, something I'm working on quite extensively, and that's going to play into all of this. Emmanuel, hey, you know what? I meant to give you a call today. Let's talk tomorrow. If you're available, let's have a quick chat tomorrow. I haven't read the secret book of John. Darn it. Yeah, you know more about me than some of these things. I mean, you're way ahead of me on some of these topics. But let's have a chat tomorrow. It would be great to catch up. Judas Iscariot was SDA. Good grief. Okay, well, you're right. You did. Okay, so by the way, guys, I'm looking for this Bulletin for Biblical Research, Volume 16, Issue 2, as a PDF. It was issued in 2006. It is in a couple of this. There's 2 articles in it that I'm really looking for, and I've not been able to find. But one of these is they're talking about the Septuagint. Now, I'm hunting down every academic reference by Protestants that discusses the Septuagint as the Bible of the early church. This is beyond doubt already. Obviously, I find Protestants will deny this because it means they have to admit the Deuterocanon, and then that's going to undermine the historical and theological claims. But it states here the Septuagint was the Old Testament of the Christian church for centuries, because it was the scripture of Israel in its Greek form that was used extensively by the New Testament writers and the early church fathers. From the time of the Reformation, only the Hebrew Masoretic eclipsed the place of the Septuagint in Protestant scholarship. So the Protestants got hold of a 10th/11th century Masoretic, which was a tradition of interpretation started in somewhere around the 6th or 7th centuries. So this is a Bible that comes, an Old Testament that comes 1,000 years after Jesus, right? Whereas the apostles were using the Septuagint. So I'm looking for this particular article. I'm hunting down all the articles I can find that discuss the Septuagint as the Bible of the early church. So if anyone knows of an access where I can get this, it's a review of when God spoke Greek, right? But it's a further discussion on that from January 1st, 2006, the place of the Greek Bible in evangelical scholarship, right? So anyway, so he speaks of New Testament exegesis that refers to the Hebrew text, where the New Testament authors, in fact, used the Greek Old Testament, is flawed, methodologically flawed. Just what I mentioned before, methodological flaws, right? And as is biblical theology that fails to give the Septuagint its historical due, because the New Testament authors weren't using the Hebrew, they were using the Greek. And these 2 Bibles, as I've discussed already, let's just say they diverge on some issues very sharply. So yeah, so bear that in mind. But if anyone has access to this Bulletin for Biblical Research, Volume 16, Issue 2, anyone can find it through an academic institution, please let me know, right? Okay, back on this. George, I'm going to have to start doing therapy if you keep spelling my name like that. All right, okay. So methodological flaws as you go. Now, the apostles consistently affirmed core doctrines like apostolic succession, and we'll see it in the early church fathers as well, and the authority of Scripture and Church without modern theological jargon. Don't forget that the person who started to undermine and reject that the early church fathers had any authority, that history was any witness to the development of Christianity, that's Martin Luther. He simply just insulted the early church fathers, said they were heretics, said they were in error, said they were wrong, and this just carried through all the other reformers, and it's become a norm today. There's also misunderstanding the development of doctrine as corruption, and of course there is misunderstanding of Bible translation, in the tradition of Bible translation, as they would improve and change that, it's not necessarily a corruption. It's merely that they're trying to improve as an understanding grows. They will try to change the translation, whether it's word for word or thought for thought, or a combination of those. And I discussed in the past about how even in the same chapter, the translator would have one methodology in the first half, and then they would change the methodology later because they found that this is a better way to translate a given passage. This is not corruption. This is merely that they're they're struggling with how do we best highlight what is being said here? How do we understand this? So the church's doctrinal clarifications over centuries were faithful defenses and articulations of apostolic truth. For instance, the development of canon was due to heresy that forced the definition of the canon. Like the Nicene Creed was forced because of heresy. So they had to define what is the nature of Jesus. These are things that happened because of heresy. Everyone assumed these. Everyone knew these. There was the apostolic tradition that everyone followed, passed on by word of mouth. However, heresy forced it. And of course, when you work in the Protestant paradigm, it's Bible alone. So therefore, it's all written, which is as they are. And of course, they reject authority, they reject tradition, but of course, they've established their own traditions and they have their own authorities. So you've got articulations of apostolic truth. They responded to heresies. They are not departures or degradations of original Christian faith. You can't have thousands of denominations all claiming to be the original apostolic Christian faith, and none of them can agree on what that was. Also, you fail to account for cultural and linguistic differences. So theological ideas are expressed within the linguistic and cultural realities of the time. So this does affect how text and doctrine should be understood without imposing modern frameworks. And of course, often people are imposing 21st century church structures on first century communities. Early churches had recognized leadership roles. The Bible very clearly speaks of bishops, elders, presbyters, and deacons. And of course, take the Baptists. They reject these, right? Anyone can be a priest. Everyone's a priest. Whoever's got the calling. Martin Luther turned this into simply anybody can decide, well, I'm a priest today, and that's it. Off I go. And of course, people just simply put their spin on this idea, and now you have this, yes, everyone's a priest, everyone's a president, everyone's a scientist, everyone on the dinghy's an engineer, for sure. So from the first century, right, you had recognized leadership roles, you have apostolic authority, you have unity, and this is not informal or purely congregational, but these systems, these modern systems, are retrojected into the past. All right, there's also selective use of historical sources. This is especially egregious when it comes to the church fathers. So they cite sources that support the narrative, ignoring contradictory evidence. Many of you will have seen this. Someone will cite the early church fathers, a sentence that supports their argument, but of course, if you read the sentence just prior or the sentence just after, he actually then clarifies and adds, well, yes, we do believe in the Bible is authoritative, but we will also believe that the Bible must be interpreted through the tradition of the church, and we have to listen to the authority of the Pope. They'll say things like that, but they'll take the first sentence and ignore the last two, right? So you can't use just favorable sources to confirm a viewpoint and overlook others that challenge or complicate it, because then you get skewed conclusions, and you see that people will take one verse that they like, ignore the verses they don't. Same thing. You take sources out of context, right? You isolate statements from their larger context, and this distorts the original meaning or intent of the author. You misrepresent the beliefs of historical groups. This happens all the time. They attribute views and motives to groups inaccurately, and they will simplify complex theological or social positions to a point where it's absurd. You ignore the broader corpus of an author's work. You focus on select passages, but you don't consider these complete writings, which give you a fuller understanding and give you a more consistent view, as opposed to isolating one sentence. And of course, you rely on secondary sources, but you avoid primary documentation. So you rely on later interpretations or summaries instead of engaging directly with the originals and the evidence. So therefore, also you're not historically accurate. Right. Now, if you are fair about this and you understand these issues, you'll be more balanced and you'll provide a more reliable historical understanding. I'll give you an example of where this is also practical, right? Where we see this. So the English Standard Version Bible, I've covered this before, the ESV and the ISV, right? But the ESV we'll use as an example here. And its associated commentaries are widely recognized, are known as skewing heavily towards Calvinist Reformed theological perspectives, because the committee that put it together was essentially Reformed Calvinist, right? So all of the commentaries in the Bible, all of the commentaries on that Bible, and even the translation of that particular Bible is very much in line with Reformed theological views. So this is evident in all of their translation choices, all the interpretive notes that align with Reformed doctrines, like, for instance, predestination, covenant theology, and so on. I've covered this in the past, but certain Bibles are very much untrustworthy. It's purely due to the bias within the translators. Now, creating false historical connections. And I raise all of these because I want to introduce all of these so that I've created something that's fairly definitive, foundational, and then I will go and show examples of this in the next series. But people do create links between unrelated historical groups based on superficial similarities, and this will be especially egregiously in like the Trail of Blood and all of these claims that Protestants were making between 1600 and 1800, trying to link themselves back to the apostles through extreme heresies. So they will link the Waldenses, the Albigenses, the Lollards, the Paulicians, the Henricians. The list is long. I will go through a bunch of these, but the list is really insane. And they'll try and make them all part of a single proto-Protestant lineage, except that these groups don't agree with each other. And in fact, they will have schisms within schisms. And so internally, they'll even fracture and disagree with each other. And there'll be different groups that have different views and conflicting views. But these groups also don't agree with each other. And some of them have a Christology that's obviously Gnostic, not even remotely Christian, right? So, but they try to make, because they're anti-Catholic, therefore they have ancient lineage, because we know the Protestant church started with Luther. And they try to say, no, it comes much earlier. But these claims all fizzle out in the 11th century with the Waldenses, right? So they try to make this proto-Protestant lineage, and they say, well, all of them pose Rome, despite significant historical and theological differences, which they ignore, right? So that's also cherry picking. Then, of course, you assume theological continuity without evidence. Claims that the Waldenses held a consistent biblical doctrine identical to Reformed Protestantism from time immemorial is false, even though historical evidence is completely lacking. And in fact, if you think about it, if Calvin and Luther and Zwingli and Knox and everyone, if they'd identified that these groups, like the Waldenses and the Albigenses, were early Christians, were the original early Christians that were persecuted, killed, maimed, slaughtered, and driven underground in caves in the Swiss Alps by these evil Catholics, then why didn't Luther become an Albigensian? Well, maybe he did, but we'll talk about that in the future. Why didn't they all become Waldenses? Why didn't they all become Paulicians? Why didn't they all be? If these were the original early Christians, if these are the early Christian roots before they were driven underground by the evil Catholics who then usurped Christianity and hijacked the religion, why didn't Calvin become one of them? How come these guys became Calvinists? I find it very strange. The Waldenses, as far as I remember, the Vaudois, became Calvinists. So if these guys were the original early Christians, the apostles' genuine early religion, then how come Calvin didn't join them? Why did they become Calvinists? Because the two theologies don't quite mix. So anyway, that's one of those questions. They also ignore significant doctrinal differences between these groups. So some Protestants would just gloss over the dualistic and Manichaean, heavily Gnostic views in Albigensian and Catholic beliefs to claim them as Protestant forebears, ignoring fundamental doctrinal differences. See if I've missed any comments here. And that's why the church used to burn Bibles, because they were false heretical translations. Yes, and that is true. DRB has always been good enough for me. Haydock's commentary, a bonus, right? And Emmanuel says, I use the Menge Bible, which usually is the most accurate and the closest to the original text, and also has no denominational bias. Only problem is it's only available in German. Okay, that is interesting. Okay, so yeah, my bot is working. Sorry, Emmanuel, but I've turned my bot back on because this is true, Ave Maria. So yeah, nobody's agreeing on a canon, no one's agreeing on doctrine, no one's agreeing on what's salvific. but they all had a common enemy, and that was good enough to be in the club. All right. So there's artificial chains of succession without historical basis. So the argument that the Waldenses, for instance, descended directly from apostolic times, or that their diaspora gave rise to subsequent movements like the Hussites and the Lollards as a neat, uninterrupted claim of Protestant lineage, that cannot be backed up by history. It's failed. Protestants tried for 200 years and failed. And they eventually said, oh, yeah, okay, we're not apostolic, we're biblical. They just changed the story. They just changed the argument. So there is very weak evidence for this. And in fact, in some cases, there's no evidence, and they all fizzle out in the 11th century anyway. And then, of course, they will conflate opposition to institutional corruption with doctrinal purity. These people do not agree on doctrine at all, right? But they identify all the medieval opponents of papal corruption, regardless of heresies or doctrinal errors. We're all in the same camp. We all hate the Catholics, right? And this all now becomes part of true Protestant lineage based solely on the opposition to Rome's institutional faults. Like take John Fox's Cloud of Witnesses, right? John Fox wrote an interesting book, which, yeah, fascinating stuff. I've covered that in the past, but not really all that relevant. So Protestant historical and theological claims were shaped by polemical needs, not based on truth, based on polemical needs, purely for disputational purposes, not rigorous evidence. And you need to, again, I've covered this in the past 4 episodes worth, but where was your church before Luther? Claims for the antiquity of Protestantism examined by S.J. Barnett. Really well worth reading that paper. It is fantastic. All right. So Ignatius of Antioch dissects a common claim. The early church was like a Protestant house church until Constantine corrupted it with hierarchy and rituals, right? Now we know that the primary sources all say otherwise, right? Ignatius of Antioch, in his letter to the Smyrnians, which is around 107 AD, writes, and this is 260 years before Constantine, right? And there was something like 25 popes before Constantine. And this is from a man who knew the Apostle John personally, right? Let no one do anything pertaining to the church without the bishop. So the bishop has authority. Let that Eucharist be considered valid, which is under the bishop or him to whom he commits it. It is not lawful apart from the bishop either to baptize or to hold an agape. So you have to be under the authority of the bishop. You must be given authority by the bishop. The bishop is connected to the man in charge. Maybe the guy sits in Rome, put 2 and 2 together there. In the same letter on the Eucharist, he writes, George says it's maddening when the Protestant tries to use church fathers that were all apostolic. The Protestant is stuck with 66 books of the Bible, and Luther and all who came after him. Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Philip. Yeah. Yeah, I'll have to tune the bot again. It's complaining about long messages. But right, on the same letter on the Eucharist, he says, they abstain from the Eucharist and prayer because they do not confess that the Eucharist is the flesh of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Now, this is an apostle of John, right? This is a disciple of the Apostle John. He knew the Apostle John. He's writing in the very beginning of the 2nd century. And he's saying that you should not abstain from the Eucharist. Now, there are churches that do abstain from the Eucharist. They don't even have an altar, right? They are born again, which became the American trademark version of I'm not a Christian. It's the Protestant Shahada. I confess that I've been really bad, and God, please come into my soul and take away my sins. And I'm going to spin around 3 times, and then I'm going to be a Christian, and I'm born again. And like, boom, done. Protestant Shahada. There you go. But Luther taught them to ignore early church history. Luther taught them that the early church fathers are corrupt, that they are heretics, that they are in error, that they bring corruption. And of course, his descendants continue with that same claim, whether implicitly or explicitly today. Now, Ignatius, in his letter to the Ephesians, also 107 AD approximately, your bishop presides in the place of God. and your presbyters in the place of the assembly of the apostles. Now, what does this prove? Yeah, just ignore the but for the moment. Sorry about that. It's complaining, but episcopal hierarchy existed in the first generation after the apostles. It was not invented by Constantine 218 years later. Now, the Eucharist was understood as Christ's literal flesh, not a symbolic memorial meal. Zwingli came along in the 1500s. Think about that. This guy is in 107, he's writing this. Sacraments require authority under the bishop. So baptism and Eucharist were not informal house church activities. There had to be an authoritative bishop in your region. Now, Ignatius learned this from John the Apostle. This is apostolic teaching. This is not later corruption. This is about 40 years after the supposed great falling away or whatever the heck that happened 10 minutes after Pentecost. Now, there are problems for the apostasy narratives. If Constantine corrupted the church in 313 AD, why does the disciple of the Apostle John describe the exact same hierarchical, sacramental, episcopal structure in 107 AD that Catholics practice today? I think it's a fair question. It's a fair historical question, and it needs honest answers. Welcome, Oremes pro invicem. Good day, everyone. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I'll be doing a lot more. I'll be covering the Baptist mythology, because it's certainly not history, in follow-on episodes. Sergeant Grinch, how are you doing? How are things with you? Emmanuel says, I am 99% convinced that the early Christian Gnostics, quote-unquote Christian, were directed by the Roman military, likely from the cult of Mithras, with the goal of undermining Christianity. You know, that is an interesting thought, and I am coming in some cases to the very same conclusion that the Ottomans were putting up groups in some way or another, influencing them or directly create, I don't know. I mean, but there's some, yeah, and you do see it. Like they were creating these splinter groups that were there to cause friction and cause disruption and to serve their will. It's like a fifth column. Yeah, you know, that's an interesting